guest today has the toughest job in state government. Some might argue that the governor or the chief of staff has the toughest job. That's really not true, and I will tell you why. Our guest today has to say no far more often than does the governor and does the chief of staff. The governor can always say, get it done. Our guest today is the Chief Operating Officer for the state of Illinois. He earned his MBA from the University of Chicago. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome back to the City Club of Chicago, the Chief Operating Officer for the state of Illinois, John Filan. John?
Thank you, Jay and Paul. Jay has I've noticed a habit of characterizing the hardest job part. And, actually, the governor usually says maybe, and it's John Harris that says yes. But in any event, the real no, I should say, is I often say maybe as well, but the reputation for no is the actual current budget director, Ginger Ostro, who could not be here today. She has a private conflict. But I would often say maybe, and it was Ginger behind me that was always saying, no, John, no, John, no, John. So you can all blame Ginger. But in all seriousness, I do want to recognize a couple of people that I'm sure all of you work with colleagues that you find that you can't do some things without, and that is to try to get a job complete, get it done, and move forward. And one of them is an alumni that was, as always, very hard to replace. And we actually refer to his replacement, if you will, if he is replaceable, is Phil Culpepper, who is the Associate Director for Debt Management, is out here somewhere in the audience. Phil, just say hello. But the guy he had to replace, a lot of you know very well, is a good friend of a lot of you, and a guy that I truly admire. And I often said that if a lot of people in the world were like this guy, it'd be a better place. But more importantly, he is almost irreplaceable. We still call Phil Culpepper the new Dave Abel, but our friend Dave Abel. And one other alumni that it's a current part-time job, doing something else in life, that it actually took two people to replace her. The current Director of Communications for the Budget Office is Kelly Quinn, who's out here somewhere, and her deputy, Catherine Ridgway. And the importance of their job is it did take two to replace one person, and that's Becky Carroll, who's sitting back there, a lot of you know. And Becky is currently the director of the Women's Vote for the Obama campaign. That's why I mentioned it's a part-time job, because I know there's only a slim minority of women that are following that, but she's doing a great job at that part-time job. In any event, only kidding. And finally, and last but far from least, someone who's been a good friend of mine and colleague for a long time that's helped us and myself through thick and thin, including this presentation, among many other things, is Ron Pecor. Okay. I'm going to try to go over the budget today in total in very brief terms, and then spend a little more focused time on the immediate finishing of the fiscal '08 budget ending June 30th, and particularly on the lottery proposal as it relates to the proposed infrastructure and capital program, as well as our pension proposal. This could not be an Illinois budget discussion without talking about pensions. It's our single biggest financial challenge, has been and remains so going forward. I think you have a mini handout of this presentation, and I'll indicate when, and you'll see the handout you have is an excerpt from the overhead here in doing so. So we're going to start with, on the first slide, Catherine, a brief overview of where we are, go into the '08 budget deficit a little bit, talk about the '09 proposed budget, Illinois Works, the capital program, and the lottery financing tool, the pension outlook, and some brief concluding comments. Basically, in terms of where we are, or so to speak, a financial state of the state, in the last three audited financial statements indicates that the general funds of the state have generated a $1.8 billion surplus in fiscal '04, fiscal '05, and fiscal '06. Fiscal '07 is not yet completely audited. That is the largest operating surplus, revenues over expenditures in the state's history in a 3-year period in more than any 1 year. As a result of that, the incoming deficit as of fiscal '03, June 2003, has been reduced from $4.1 billion to $2.3 billion at the end of fiscal '06. Once again, the largest single positive movement in the state's history. At the same time, we also increased the number of important human and healthcare services. As you know, in the first term, we expanded healthcare for family care. We instituted the All Kids program, where all children have access to health insurance, universal preschool, and record education funding, more in those 4 years than any 4 years in state government. Although pension remains our single biggest financial challenge, we did improve the funded ratio, the ratio of assets to liabilities, from 48% in 2003 to 62.6%, pardon me, at the end of fiscal year '07, the last time it was measured by the retirement system actuaries. We also reduced headcount substantially. The headcount in the state was 69,000 people in fiscal 2002, before we came into office. As the end of fiscal '07 and today is 55,800. That is almost a 20% reduction in the workforce, and without a major layoff in the process, but through a series of attrition, as well as the early retirement program from the George Ryan administration, where we did a lot of vacancy control to not hire vacancies that occurred as a result of that. So we've kept it at that head count now for 3 years, and the outlook for the state going forward is we should be able to remain so. And also bonded debt. We hear a lot about debt in discussions in the media and that, but when you look at the general obligation debt of the state, the bonds that we issue to fund capital programs, the general obligation bonded debt in fiscal '07 and by fiscal '08 is down 2 years in a row. That's the first time in Illinois state government's history that our bonded debt for capital projects has gone down 2 years in a row. The last time it went down even 1 year in a row was 1997. And that bonded debt is down about $1 billion. That's roughly 10% of the bonded debt. That's separate from the pension bond financing, which is replacement financing for the pension debt itself. But in terms of a regular bonded debt, it's down $1 billion. We certainly have challenges ahead. The pension reforms, and we're proposing this year a $16 billion pension bond to hopefully have as much success as we did in 2003 with the one we did then, to further control pensions. It remains, once again, our single biggest financial challenge. We're proposing to adopt an Illinois Works capital program, which we'll go into later, leveraging our lottery as a principal financing source to fund that with cash as opposed to borrowing for a large part of the program, and our continued commitment to health care and education funding going forward. On the next chart, you can see just visually that in '03, the deficit fund balance was $4.2 billion. On the left, the black square indicates $1.8 billion of positive profits, if you will, generated in the first 3 fiscal years on an audited basis, reducing that cumulative deficit from $4.2 billion to $2.3 billion at the end of fiscal year '06. The next slide is a little bit hard to read. I'm not going to ask you to, but it looks at all governmental funds for the 50 states. And it's very hard to get apples-to-apples comparisons when you look at other states because they're all run a bit differently. But if you look at all the governmental funds, all the ones under the state control, so you exclude trust funds and things of that nature, and Illinois, under its current accounting practices, has $1.7 billion surplus in all governmental funds. That ranks Illinois in the about 43rd in the 50 states. However, if Illinois recognized its federal revenues and its educational special funding the same way the majority of other states do, and in particular 8 of the 10 biggest states, Illinois would not be 43rd, it would be 26th to have a $4 billion cumulative surplus. That is the way the rating agencies view Illinois, and that is the closest apples-to-apples comparison you can see. Having said that, it doesn't change the fact that Illinois has many, many financial challenges to do so. We're now going to talk briefly about the '08 budget. and where we stand now in the current fiscal year. Illinois' fiscal year, for those of you who aren't close to this, goes from July to June. So we're in fiscal year '08, ending this June 30th of '08. And in this particular fiscal year, the graph on the left, you have this in your packet, indicates that in fiscal '07, the actual revenues are $28.6 billion in the general funds. The introduced budget last spring estimated about $29.4 billion, or a growth of about $800 million, which is what you can expect in a relatively good economy. The budget that passed the General Assembly in August of 2007, fiscal '08, doubled that increase from $800 million to $1.6 billion in order to make the spending in there basically balance. A $1.6 billion increase of '08 over '07. There's only 2 years in the history of Illinois that has ever achieved that level of revenue growth, and those are in 2 of the bubble.com years in the late '90s. So it was a very, very aggressive revenue forecast, with the Committee on Government and Financing Authority the Committee on Governmental Accountability in the General Assembly indicated that it was an overly optimistic budget in doing so in terms of the revenue assumption. Consequently, that breeds a deficit because the spending that was approved in the process cannot be financed by the revenues that were assumed. The governor vetoed $460 million last fall. The original intention was to use that for further health care, but shortly thereafter, we could see that the economy was not going to produce that kind of revenue assumption, so that health care spending was slowed down in order to accommodate the rest of the budget. The current forecast, which the legislative bipartisan committee agrees with, is about $29.5 billion, slightly ahead of the original revenue forecast. That will leave us a shortage of about $800 million roughly in revenues for the year, or 750 to be more exact. That is a projected deficit. We have an insufficient amount of revenues that were assumed to pay for the current spending. So there's a couple of ways to deal with that. A lot of states, as you've probably been reading, have been having significant deficit problems, both this year and going forward. Virtually every major state in the union, some having extraordinarily serious deficit problems. California, New York, Florida, Arizona, a number of those states, typically healthy states, have gone through some very significant changes. Just yesterday, Arizona announced that it would be transferring $300 million from its special purpose funds into its general funds, delaying the K through 12 payment into next year for $300 million, and also doing some across-the-board cuts. Coincidentally, that's the very proposal that we have before the General Assembly. We want to work with them on. It has passed the Senate. It's pending in the House. We want to work with them to try to get a solution, not unlike Arizona and not unlike some of the states you see here. So both very large states, California, Arizona, Florida, New Jersey, have significant issues this year and next year, and even small states like Maine as well. The options basically are the ones that certainly you know in your own life. Either cut spending, increase revenues, or use some available resources we have elsewhere in government. Our proposal is to not make the reductions that were approved by the General Assembly, but to fund education, to fund social services, and to fund higher education as well. But if we don't get the money, the real cash to do it, we can't pay the bills to do so. So our proposal is to transfer $530 million from special state funds, which we've done in the past a number of times, and as you mentioned, other states do as well, including Arizona, and that will get us a long way home to closing that deficit for fiscal year '08. If you look at the next chart, it shows a history here of fund transfers in the state of Illinois. Every governor, Governor Thompson, Governor Edgar, and Governor Ryan, as well as Governor Blagojevich, has done fund transfers to a substantial degree throughout their administration. In the governor's administration, since fiscal '03, we have transferred $1.8 billion from these 700 special funds into the general fund in order to support education and health care. In the last 4 years, the average has been $409 million of transfers each and every year to do so. In the current budget, fiscal year '08, no fund transfers were adopted, even though the money is in fact there and available. Our proposal is to do what we have done successfully the last several years, transfer that money into the general fund, and we can avoid reducing or deferring that spending. So once again, it comes down to some choices. We can move the money in the budget that's there, not make these reductions, or we can not make the 23rd and 24th payment to our schools throughout the state, about $400 and some million, which they depend on. And in the past several years, we paid early in June. That's one choice we prefer not to make, but it's one we'd have to make. Another one would be reducing grants to social service agencies, to higher education and community colleges, if the money isn't there, and basically to reduce their June payment. Once again, they're all expecting, but if we can't get the money in there, the cash is not there, therefore we have to reduce that. A third alternative, which we've done in the past, is to extend what's called the Medicaid payment cycle. The payment cycle is the average number of days the state takes to pay medical providers who are critical supports throughout the state. That has been done in the past. It's currently an average cycle of 70 days. Not a level we like, but in the budget that was passed at General Assembly, the governor's recommendation for Medicaid was reduced by $300 million. In reducing that budget by $300 million, that means we can pay fewer bills without the appropriation authority to do so. In the past, under Governor Edgar and under Governor Ryan, that payment cycle was increased to 120 days in order to accommodate budget shortages. We don't think we should do that. That's not our approach to doing so, but once again, without the cash, those are the alternatives. So we like to work with the General Assembly and find a way to get a combination of fund transfers and other things in order to balance out the fiscal year 08 budget. That's something we're working on and have been in the last month or so, and we look forward going back next week to complete that task. Now briefly on the fiscal 09 budget. Going into that budget, a number of things have been put in place and remain in place. As I mentioned before, you can see the history here of the state's personnel headcount. Generally was in the mid-60s and up to 70,000 personnel in the state. We reduced that as a result of a number of actions, and it retains now down at $55,000 employees, pardon me. That kind of reduction translates structurally in the budget to over $1 billion a year in savings each and every year recurring by downsizing the workforce that way. The next slide, you have this in your packet. This comes from the Comptroller's Office, where they compare what's called awards and grants funding, the blue line, to operational funding, which is the red line. The red line basically is the inside of government. It's personnel, contractual services, office space, utilities, and so on, how we run government. You can see that line has been flat for the last 5 years. And in fact, in fiscal 07, the total spending remains still lower than it was in fiscal 02. Where the increases have been outside government, almost exclusively in education, healthcare, and pensions. And so the focus is to not grow the size of government, but grow the effectiveness of government by funding education and healthcare principally. Finally, I mentioned earlier, these are the actual numbers regarding reducing the bonded debt of the state. In fiscal 07, it was down about $500 million, and in fiscal 08, it'll be down another $500 million for a reduction of $1 billion in outstanding bonded debt in the last 2 years. Going into the 09 budget, the main proposals are to increase the annual pension payment by $300 million up to almost $3 billion as an annual contribution, to increase education with an increase in existing gaming taxes on casinos, to increase that payment to education by $300 million. All other spending would therefore go up less than 1% in the rest of the budget. Some of that is accomplished by reductions in budgets, and some of that's accomplished by finding other funding sources or other revenue sources to support them, such as fees. We also still propose the governor's Illinois covered health care proposal to bring about access to health insurance to those that do not have it. That would not be in the general funds, but have its own revenue source through an employer assessment on those employers that do not provide health insurance. That would, once again, not be in the general fund, but would be a separate proposal off balance sheet, if you will, to fund access to health care. We also have structurally in the budget two very important going forward efforts. One is Illinois Works, the capital program proposed by the governor, and working with ex-speaker Dennis Hastert and ex-congressman and SIU President Glenn Bouchard. They've convened a committee to try to move Illinois forward with a strong capital program. I'll mention that in a moment. And we want to fund a lot of that with the proposal to do a long-term partial concession of the lottery. Also, looking at the data in the market regarding the effectiveness of pension bonds, we're proposing to consider issuing another pension bond this year comparable to how we did in 2003 that ended up being very successful. So an overview of the budget, you can see here is there's an overall 4% increase in the budget, but that includes the increased revenue for education, and it basically has three increases. $600 million for Medicaid, that's about a 7% increase. Half of that comes from federal revenues. $300 million for education, $300 more for pensions, and everything else, $200 million or less than 1% of the budget to do so. And that's kind of the overview of the '09 budget. I want to talk a little bit, what I mentioned is two of the core issues that I think are important for the state structurally going forward on a long-term basis and important to our success in this year's budget. That is Illinois Works, the capital program, and the lottery financing agent. The Illinois Works program is approximately $25 billion, one of the largest in the country. $11 billion of that comes from state funding. The rest is from roughly $10 billion of federal funds, primarily for roads, bridges, and transit, and another $3 or $4 billion of local matches for schools and some roads as well. In total, it's about $5 billion for schools, including higher education, $14 billion for roads and bridges throughout the state, $3.2 billion for public transit, passenger rail, and airports, $1.1 billion for economic development and housing, and $600 million for improvement and renovation of state facilities, primarily state hospitals and prisons and some office buildings. The source we're recommending for that is to do a partial concession of the Illinois lottery, and that would finance 70% of the program on a pay-as-you-go basis, meaning we wouldn't have to borrow. The remainder would come from roughly half from the road fund to finance some of the road fund bonds, and the other half, or about $100 million, would come from various other funds, such as environmental funds, to fund some of the environmental programs to do so. On this, the lottery challenges, Illinois has had a lottery since 1974. It is a very, very different industry today than it was then, meaning that it competes with the entire gaming industry. It competes with Mexico's sports betting, which all of you are familiar with, some of you might even play. It competes with ubet.com, an international program where you can do live pari-mutuel betting online that is illegal, although practiced legally in many states. It also competes with high technology service from Atlantic City and Las Vegas, as well as Korea sports betting. So what's happened is we now have a governments running basically a retail business competing with a very high technology, highly mobile technology gaming business. As an example, there are $25 billion wagered each year in our 9 casinos. There's $2 billion wagered in the Illinois lottery. So when concessionaires look at this, they look at an opportunity to say, if we can move some of that gaming dollar from casinos to lottery, the lottery makes $1 in every 3. So if you move $1 billion of that $25 billion to the lottery, that's $300 million in additional profit. So you need to have an agile, well-financed operator to do that. State governments are not agile. They don't make decisions quickly. They don't raise capital quickly. And to compete in this industry, you have to be agile. You have to raise money quickly, decide quickly, and move forward. The lottery under concession would remain under the regulatory control of the state as it does today. There would be a lottery control board with bipartisan membership that would approve all advertising and all gaming. It does not assume any expansion of the lottery in terms of internet lottery, in terms of video games or Keno. If that were to happen in the future, the winning concessionaire would have to pay extra money for that, but it is not contemplated in their bid, nor would it be part of what was being offered to them this year unless the General Assembly were to so approve. So the lottery has many challenges. Among them is if you play the lottery, you'll notice a lot of the lottery is in 7,000 locations throughout the state. That's a huge retail network that we're really not well equipped to manage. Much of it's in service stations. In the old days, before there was self-service gas, people would go into the service station store, buy a lottery ticket or two, come out and move on. Now with self-serve, it doesn't occur that much anymore, so our sales at service stations are down quite a bit. The result of that is that lottery sales are impacted, although there's technology out there to actually put lottery dispensing machines in gas tanks, so while you're paying $5 a gallon, you can spend a few more bucks on a lottery ticket. But that requires, an agile, quick decision process to do so and to raise money to do so. But more importantly, it's where we're situated, these 7,000 locations. We're no longer at where people congregate. The changing structure of businesses, companies like Walmart, Target, Costco, and others are huge national chains, Starbucks, Dunkin' Donuts, and so on. And to get in those businesses with your product, you have to have a very effective corporate marketing strategy to do so. Governments don't do that very well. If we want to go into the CEO of Walmart, we have to have the kind of presentation, discussion, financing tool to persuade those people why it's important to put our product in their stores. What we're really saying here is this is really more and more of a private business. Government shouldn't be running it, but we are proposing a partial concession where the state would continue to own 20% of it and the private concessionaire would own 80% of it. The concession would be for 50 years. They'd own 80%. we'd expect to reap about $10 billion as a result of that for the state. We'd own 20% of the gross revenues after prizes, not the net revenues. That would result in a beginning point of about $200 million a year in a trust fund for education, along with $3 to $4 billion of the proceeds of the lottery to go in a trust fund as well. And once again, the lottery would keep being regulated by the Lottery Control Board with bipartisan membership. We've presented this proposal to most of the major business organizations and most of the labor unions. We think it's been well received. I don't want to speak for them, but I think they feel that this is something that should be seriously looked at. The next chart you see before you is a little bit complicated, but basically Goldman Sachs and UBS and Scott Ballas, who are principal advisors on the lottery concession proposal, have structured a education trust fund that takes the proceeds of the lottery sale, $3 to $3.5 billion, together with the interest on that and the 20% ownership, and structured it in a way that over time that it would continue to put $600 million per year into education. Now, it should put the education funding in context. Education funding in Illinois is about $9 billion. So as important as the lottery is, it's a very small part of education, and it's not the determinant by which education funding is made, but this is part of it. And the model that they put together basically takes the assumed price that syndicates have indicated they'd pay, roughly $10 billion, and what they'd have to earn to make that investment justified. And using that growth factor together with the $3 billion in the trust fund and the interest on that, we're able to provide a cash flow of $600 million to replace the lottery funding that currently exists. Finally, in closing the lottery, it would be $7 billion of upfront cash. We'd be using a non-core asset to fund core functions of the state, principally our infrastructure and schools, both higher education and P through 12. We'd issue that much less in bonds in a difficult tax-exempt bond market, and consequently, we would save about $400 million a year in interest by doing pay-as-you-go with the lottery. And we also expect to get, like the Chicago Skyway did, Indiana did, by being the first mover, getting a premium for the Illinois lottery, being a major state lottery that would go to a private concession. There are about 10 states currently considering it, among them Massachusetts, New York, Florida, Texas, California, Vermont, among several others. I now want to proceed on to pensions. It's not possible to have a discussion about the Illinois budget without talking about pensions, and we want to review that with you as well. The pension problem in Illinois has been happening for over 30 years. Every year, every single year, without fail, since the 1970s, the pensions were underfunded by large amounts, anywhere from several $100 million to over $1 billion in terms of how much was put in to prevent the pension debt from growing versus how much was needed. By design, the current funding plan, which is a 50-year funding plan, no different than a 50-year mortgage, underfunds the pensions each and every year until 2033. So when it was adopted in 1995, the amount owed then was $20 billion. The significance of that meant that since it would underfund for 40 years, it meant not one nickel of the $20 billion that was owed in 95 would be paid until 2033. That means the entire principal amount owed was being deferred 40 years. You can all think of your own mortgages and think what that would mean if you were to do that in your financing. So it's not something we can afford to do. And because of what the pensions have to earn to meet a defined benefit plan, the interest rate in that is 8.5%, equally intolerable. Under the 95 plan, as we are today, the pension debt is $43 billion. It was about $43 billion in 2003. If you recall, in 95, when the pension was adopted, when the pension funding plan was adopted, it was $20 billion. So in 8 short years after that plan was in effect, it went from $20 billion to $43 billion. $6 billion of that, in fairness, was due to investment losses, which do come back. But the other $16 billion was due to purposeful underfunding and expansion of benefits without any new funding to pay for them. So if we were just to keep the $43 billion not growing, if we just want to have it not get worse, we'd have to put $3.7 billion of cash in interest in the pension fund, plus $1.3 billion of the annual pension expense, keeping in mind that employees earn pension rights each and every year. Those two together are $5 billion. Okay? If we were to follow the pension funding plan this year exactly, we would call for a little over $3 billion. okay? This is 13 years into the funding plan, and we're still only paying 60% of what we should pay just to stay even. That's why it's intolerable, and I think audiences like this should consider it intolerable to do so. This next page you have in your packet, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it other than to say, I'd ask you to look at it very closely. In the first column, you'll see where we were actually in June 30, 03. $43 billion unfunded debt, 48% funded, that's assets to liabilities. The projected liability for 2045 was roughly $60 billion, and the funded ratio expected in 2045 was about 90%. If we did not do the reforms passed in 2005, some benefit changes, and did not issue the pension bond, the unfunded liability today, according to estimates by Deloitte, would be about $55 billion. The funded ratio would be just 52%. The unfunded liability today would be $60 billion. But instead, as a result of all this, the pension liability today is $42 billion. The funded ratio is 63%, and the expected liability by 2045 at 90% will be $52 billion, not $60 billion. This is such a huge problem, even though these are big numbers, and when you save $3 billion, it's a lot of money, but doesn't sound like much when compared to 50 in doing so. Now, it's important to point out that this is looking at the pension liability by itself. We also have a pension bond to pay off of $10 billion. So look on the far right-hand column, when you look at the $42 billion, that is the pension debt, but you have to add to that the $10 billion for the pension bond. So a total of $52 billion, okay? But the difference is we're paying 8.5% in the $42 billion, and on the $10 billion, we're paying 5.05%. And therein lies the core of the issue and why it was successful. So we owe $3 billion less than we otherwise would have, partly from reforms, partly because of the pension bond, and we're paying $10 billion of it a lot cheaper than otherwise would have. And those savings will continue to expand and grow in future years, but in the 4 short years it's been out there, it's already produced substantial savings, but once again, not enough. I mentioned the reforms passed in 2005. We proposed far more than were adopted. We got about a third of a loaf, so to speak, but even with that, we reduced the projected liability in the pension fund, that is the bar on the left, that would have been $530 billion, according to system actuaries in 2045, to $447 billion. That's an $83 billion savings in long-term liability, or 16%. The importance of that is this. This number, the total liability, that's what we're liable for. Okay? If the pension funds were to lose all the money tomorrow, every nickel of it, we'd be liable for that. So we have to focus on the total liability. The unfunded liability is just a difference between the assets and the liabilities, but it's that total liability the state's full faith and credit is behind. And consequently, it's important to drive that number down over time and adopt things to do so. The result of the reforms, as well as the pension bond, means that between now and 2045, just going forward, rather than spend $347 billion on pension contributions, we'll spend $313. So we save $34 billion in contributions just by those two actions alone. Our proposal this year is to do two things. One is to propose considering issuing $16 billion in pension bonds, maybe not all right away, but over the course of the next year, and change the funding schedule so we fund more sooner and try to get out of this hole we've dug ourselves in. So our proposal is to issue $16 billion of pension bonds. It brings the funded ratio to 75% immediately. We've worked with all 4 caucuses on this and the representatives to get their input on how to do it, and then see if we can keep it at 75% and let it grow to 90% sooner. The result of this is say each and every year to increase the pension contribution $280 million, but so it stays current in terms of value to put a COLA on that every year at 3%. I recognize these are a lot of numbers to follow, but this is a very deep, deep problem in the state of Illinois to do so. So if we do that, this graph shows that the red line is the current plan, and you can see it gets steeper and steeper and incredibly steep by 2045. This possibly is the single most intergenerational decision this state can make. If we do this, we will save $55 billion additional dollars going forward. And that $55 billion is the difference between the red line and the blue line. Okay? What it means is that we'll get 90% funded 12 years sooner in 2033 rather than 2045. And rather than pass those huge payments, 14, 15, and $16 billion a year to our children and grandchildren, we will not do that. We'll take the responsibility ourselves. But once again, this is a $55 billion proposal. It's a number I almost can't even fathom to believe that numbers get this big. But it's real, it's existing, and it's growing, and we should not tolerate it any longer. We should not tolerate paying this exorbitant interest rate. We can avoid it, and we should try to find a way to pay this liability down as quickly as possible. The next page in your packet, you'll see it, indicates the result of this. All these actions is we moved the funding ratio from 48% to currently 62%. If we do this, we'll go to 75% immediately as a result of the pension bonds. And the result of that, you'll see, is once again a comparison of the blue line and the red line. If we stick on the current plan, you can see ever so slowly we reach 90%. If we go to the blue line, we hit it in 2033, 12 years sooner, and save the money that I mentioned. On the next chain indicates the savings here. If we didn't do any of these actions, the 2003 pension bond, the reforms, or the proposed one, we would disperse $347 billion to the pension funds. Instead, as a result of what we've already done, those contributions will be reduced $313 billion over the next 30 years. And if we do this proposal, it'll get reduced to $258 billion. Still a huge amount of money, but the result, which you have in your packet on the benefits, is between the 2003 pension bond, the reforms passed in 2005, and this year's proposal, we will save $90 billion in terms of what we would have contributed versus what we contribute as a result of these reforms and this pension bond. So as you can see, there are opportunities here. The market gives us opportunities. We shouldn't pass them up. We think a wise action to consider would be to put the state in a position to try out the lottery lease with certain parameters and certain restrictions, such as not take less than a certain amount, otherwise not authorized, to try the pension bond again with certain parameters that we shouldn't issue the bond if the interest rate is more than a certain amount. And with the General Assembly's cooperation, we can use this opportunity to save literally billions of dollars, and particularly billions of dollars for the next generation. So we have a very, very big opportunity here to do the right thing for Illinois, who's been in the wrong place for a very long time on pension funding, to do so. So once again, in conclusion, I'm sure you all can take a deep breath and enjoy that part. In conclusion, in the last several years, 3 in particular, we have generated record surpluses. That's why the deficit's gone down from $4.2 billion to $2.3 billion. We still have a ways to go. We have increased healthcare education spending, both and particularly universal preschool and record education funding. The funded ratio for pensions is improved dramatically. Still a long way to go, but much, much better than it was. Headcount remains under control in the state. We have a smaller government today than we had 4 years ago. And once again, for the first time in recorded history, we've reduced bonded debt 2 years in a row. Going forward, we absolutely have to address this pension issue. I really ask your help on that as active business people throughout the state, is talk to members, talk to us, talk to others. Your business organizations have been briefed on this or informed on it, as well as Illinois Works. The infrastructure of Illinois needs tending to, needs dollars spent on it. We think lottery is a cost-efficient way to do it. At the same time, we want to continue education funding and access to health care as well. Those are our overall goals going forward for Illinois. It remains complex. It remains a challenge. A lot of you in this room have helped a great deal, both as volunteers and as business people in doing so, and we'll need your help going forward. And with that, that's as I promised, the conclusion. And it really is over. And I will be happy to take any questions you might have. Thanks very much.
If you want to ask the question, I stand behind Skill and Charybdis there, Kathy and Jill. And John will give you very short answers. And before you leave, there will be a very, very short quiz on some of these numbers. I'm sure most of you, it's fill in the blank. We don't even want to make a multiple choice. So, Kathy, short questions.
Mine's short about the lottery. The lottery is the worst bet in town. You keep 50% of the money before you return anything. Slots, were like a 4% hold. Horse racing is like 17.5%, I think. Why are you looking so hard to push and sell something that's a bad bet? And it's bad for the people of Illinois who spend their money on lottery. Do you think you'd get more people using it if it were a better percentage payoff?
Well, I think Illinois has had the lottery since 1974, and the groups we've talked to that are interested in investing in this do not look at the existing lottery market as one they would expand. They believe it's saturated. They see two principal places to go. One, through moving to the more active consumer locations like the Walmarts and Costco's of the world, is to reach the buying public, and particularly those occasional lottery buyers who are not regular lottery buyers. And secondly, to try to get the other gaming dollars by having more competitive products to spend their money on lottery, not on casinos, or not on sports betting, or not on ubet.com. That's where they see the growth in the market and why they think it's worth the kind of investment that we're talking about.
Okay, but I mean, 50% is still a huge hold when it's compared to 4% on slots. I don't know how you're going to get closer.
Well, I think the idea is how, I'm not a gaming expert, okay, but how attractive the product is relative to discretionary dollars. But the lottery puts off a lot more profit than casinos do, but casinos have other things to go with it. They have entertainment, they have dining, they have a variety of things to do so. But there are a lot of lotteries in this country that do much better than Illinois, and these operators believe they can do better as well, otherwise they wouldn't be interested.
Okay, I can't go anymore.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you for your presentation. Jill Zwick. I'm actually serving as a surrogate for my seatmate here, Judy Bartopinka, because my knees currently work. So thank you. So here is Judy's question. It relates to the All Kids and the Medicaid programs and how we're dragging out the repayment. You mentioned in your presentation, I think it was up to 70 days. So her question relates to how hospitals, nursing homes, et cetera, as well as MDs who are now kind of withdrawing from the system because of the dragging out, how that's affecting the budget numbers that you presented at the beginning, the 08 budget, and that dragging out factor.
Okay. Well, first of all, I think, and you're welcome to contact the Department of Health Care and Family Services for more detail, but physicians have not left the system. The physicians in the All Kids program and elsewhere are substantially up, not down, over the last several years. The payment cycle is not where we want it to be. The budget we introduced for fiscal year 08 had a 60-day payment cycle on it. When the budget that passed, Medicaid was reduced by $300 million, that increased the payment cycle, the speed at which we pay bills, from 60 days to 70 days. Our proposal is to keep working it down as much as possible, but to do that, you have to have both the appropriation authority and the revenues to do so.
Okay, can I ask a question
Sure.
on my behalf now?
Now you're Jill Zwick.
Now I'm Jill Zwick. The $1 million that went to Pilgrim Church after the fire, et cetera, that school, and the lady who got her record expunged or pardoned, can you give us an explanation on what's going on with that and if we're going to get the $1 million back?
I think the department that is that engaged in that grant is investigating it. It's going through a legal process right now, and to see, there was a mistake made clearly by the state. That's our responsibility. We're trying to correct it to recover that money, but we first have to evaluate all the circumstances and make sure that we're on solid grounds to do so.
Okay, thank you.
By the way,
No,
for the
there's no one
record,
behind
wait 1 second. By the record, I think John Harris left the room on that question. Just
Okay.
that
Since there was no one behind me, I have another one on pensions that I don't understand.
Well, no, hey, guys, this is not a family club meeting.
Okay,
Just-
well, anyway.
Just get a very
Okay.
short question.
I don't, okay. In the real world, not the government world, every company doesn't give a pension. I understand you've got to give pensions now because constitutionally you had to. Why can't you say in the future that the workers themselves have to save the money and I don't have to support them for the rest of their lives?
Well, I think that we have addressed the pension situation very aggressively. In 2003, we proposed a pension bond that was adopted. In 2005, we proposed several pension reforms. I should note that the pension reforms that were adopted were a Republican vote in the other chamber, not a single Republican vote. It was passed all by Democrats. It did improve the pension liabilities, not enough as we stepped forward. It was the first pension reform in the history of 2005, and it did save $83 billion, according to the system actuaries, as a result of those reforms. We're now proposing further reforms as a result, and to use the pension obligation bond and to pay the pension debt off sooner than the current plan calls for. So we've taken three major steps that others have not. It remains a problem. It was a problem that went on for 30 years, never attended to, never dealt with.
That wasn't the answer, but I know other people, not the answer to my question.
He's bound to have a longer question. I'm Joyce Saxon. I'm a member of the Board of Governors of City Club. I guess there's something about the lottery that appeals to women. I'm curious as to who our prospective partners would be. Being a true Chicagoan, I have visions of Las Vegas Mafia being our partners. When you say syndicate, that conjures up things to me.
Good question.
Have you talked to some people seriously?
He's right. First of all, there is a very, very detailed vetting process that any of potential owners have to go through to be approved on this. However, the ones that have expressed interest and have come forward generally are very similar to the same types of firms that have the concession for the Skyway and the Indiana Lottery. Almost all of them have as one of their partners one of the major lottery operators, such as Lottomatic and GTech or Intralot Scientific Games that do business throughout the United States. And so it's generally private equity firms that have the financing element of it, and firms that operate lotteries here and in Europe that have the operational side of it. Does that answer your question?
Jeff Berkowitz, host and producer of Public Affairs, airing every Monday night throughout the city of Chicago at 8:30 p.m. Cable Channel 21. Tonight's guest, coincidentally, State Rep John Fritchie. Watch the show. Good to see you, John. A former guest of Public Affairs, John Filan. Stalling for time. On the lottery issue, you mentioned that if it run more efficiently, you could make more money than even the money that goes into gaming as gaming money. It sounded like you're suggesting would be diverted from people spending on gaming, casinos, to spending on the lottery. But even if you aren't suggesting that, you know that the state of Illinois is competing for those dollars in the gaming industry. And they're competing in the entertainment industry. People shift money from movies to casinos to lottery and so forth. The point is, isn't that kind of a weak way to develop economic growth in the state of Illinois? Betting on casinos, betting on gaming, betting on running your lottery more efficiently so you can induce more low-income people who are less educated with less income to spend more money to finance your programs? Is that any way to run a railroad?
I think you've mischaracterized it very well there, Jeff.
Thank you, John. Is Rosie Scenario here? You forgot to introduce Rosie.
The lottery is in Illinois for 30 years, so it's well established throughout its retail operations in the state. And the suggestion is twofold. One is that we need the infrastructure now for roads, bridges, transit, and schools. It's long overdue. This is not a core function of the state, and it doesn't make sense to me, at least, for state governments to be managing a retail business with 7,000 locations, and for that matter, a gaming business, particularly when you're competing with very well-financed, very agile gaming operators throughout the world and even throughout this state. So we think a more effective way to do that is to have people run the lottery that already exists, that know how to run it, and are in a position to make the kind of investment that should be made, but once again, under the regulatory control, just like utilities, just like casino gaming is here in Illinois. And they would not be proposing the kinds of concession lease prices we've talked about and we've proposed unless they felt that opportunity was there and to be done more so by them than by us.
Thank you.
Last question comes from the moderator, believe it or not. John, don't run away. Do you and Dan Hines, Ralph Martiri, the Illinois Tax Foundation, do you all use the same books? Because when I get all my stuff from them, this state is sinking like the Titanic, and the way you describe it, we're in Fat City. Where is the difference? Or is there a difference? Or probably they're wrong and you're right.
It's a very good question, and I'll mention two things. One is the budgets in most states are adopted year to year, and you attempt to balance a budget in that 12-month period. some years come and go, and as you've seen in the past, in 2003, there was an accumulated deficit of $4.2 billion. Now, I mentioned in the opening comments, we just received Friday and today affirmed ratings from Standard & Poor's and Moody's, pardon me. Sorry, Moody's. And those ratings are AA stable. I wanted two things there, AA stable. Okay, so, they rate all the states around the country, okay? And if they looked at the state the way you had mentioned some others do, I don't think we would be AA stable. Now, let me give one example, because if you take a minute, because you happen to ask the question, so I just happen to have a slide,
We didn't concoct this, did we? No.
No, Paul and I did not talk beforehand whatsoever, okay? And I need my little book, excuse me. But in anticipation that somebody as schooled as you would possibly ask this, okay? But in all seriousness, it is a good question, and I'm not surprised it came from Paul. A couple of months ago, the Comptroller's Office prepared something called a preliminary unaudited estimates. It was an innovative term, but nonetheless, it was there, and suggested that at the end of June 30, 2007, that the state's deficit fund balance, rather than $2.3 billion, roughly $2 billion better than it was in fiscal 03, was at $3.6 billion. Still better than fiscal 03, but nonetheless 3.6. We have discussed this point, included legal opinions, included a international accounting firm's opinion, included over 9 chief financial officers in the state of Illinois' opinion, included the opinion of chief internal auditor of the state of Illinois, okay, and they come with a different conclusion. The first item you see here is the $3.6 billion. Now, how that 3.6 occurred in 07, increasing from 2.3, if you recall, in 06, is that the state has something called a hospital assessment tax, relatively unique in Illinois. And what it is a mechanism or a way that some people in the hospital industry are familiar with of getting more federal money, not state money, federal money to hospitals. The federal government approves it, and the way it works is this. I'm going to try to be as simple here as possible. The federal government generally reimburses Medicaid spending $600 million. Generally reimburses Medicaid spending 50%, pardon me. The goal here was to get the hospitals about $500 million of new money. No new services, no new medical services, no invoices, no bills sent, just windfall money. So the way to do that was to pass a hospital assessment tax that Senator Jeff Schellenberg and others supported, probably Representative Fritchie supported as well. I think it's a very good program. And the state advances $1.2 billion to the hospitals. The hospitals turn around and almost immediately give us $730 million back in the hospital assessment tax. Okay. The federal government gives us half of the $1.2 billion in 48 hours. So the two together, the $730 million from the hospitals and the $600 million from the federal government, if you do the math, ends up at $1.33 billion. We've advanced 1.2. We've done this 5 years in a row. The state makes $130 million. That's why the General Assembly adopted it. It was good for the hospitals, good for the state. The Comptroller's Office is proposing that as of June 30th, 2007, now almost a year ago, we should somehow recognize just one side of that transaction and ignore economic reality and just score the $1.2 billion of money that we advance to the hospitals. Now, if you're a bank, when you advance money, that's a loan, that's an asset. They owe you money. We advance them the money. But to record that as a liability in a separate fund, okay, and not record the certain federal revenue and not record the hospital assessment tax by law they must pay, and somehow say, excuse my elevation voice here, and somehow say that that's a $3.6 billion deficit. It just isn't. It's not economic reality. It's not economic substance. Yeah, you can twist accounting principles lots of ways, as we all know, in both private industry and government, but it's not economic reality. The other irony is that here it is in February when it was first announced, okay, and the transaction was 100% completed back in August and September. Okay, the 1.2 was out, the 1.33 was in, was all over, states ahead of the game. And in February, we're saying, oh my goodness, look at this 3.6 number, when in fact it ignored economic reality, did not agree with the CFOs of every state agency in the state of any size, did not agree with the chief internal auditor, did not agree with legal opinion, and so on. So we can all use accounting principles to express things a certain way, but it's not reality. We had the same discussion with rating agencies, and they are as befuddled as I am and probably some of you are. So that brings us back to $2.3 billion, okay? That is the consistent historical deficit that it was in the 06 statements that was reduced from 4.2 and 03. The only way you go from 4.3 negative, 4.2 negative, 2.3 negative is have $1.8 billion of positive. Otherwise, the math doesn't work. Our point here is going forward is just a matter of when you're comparing apples and apples. People like to say, oh, how does Illinois compare to this, this, and that? Well, if you're going to compare Illinois to this, this, and that, okay, then let's have apples and apples. If you read Standard & Poor's Outlook in December of 07, not my words, their words, they understand that almost all the big states, and almost all the big states, 8 out of the 10 biggest states in the country, except Illinois and Ohio, and the majority of all states, they record Medicaid revenue when the Medicaid expense is deemed eligible. And the reason they do is because the Fed money is certain and they reimburse quickly in doing so. Illinois does not do that. Because of a quirk in the law is one of 6 states, 44 do not. It's mostly rural states except for Illinois and Wisconsin, have an odd way of recording in state law what are called mandated categorical education spending, which is basically special education and transportation. The rating agencies have acknowledged this for years. And what in effect we do is we record, to use Ron Pacour's term, $101 billion of spending in 100 years, whereas the other 44 states record 100 years of spending in 100 years. We advance, record, or recognize next year's categorical education spending. So when you make these adjustments, okay, for Illinois' overly conservative accounting, that's how Illinois ends up, what I mentioned before, still with many financial challenges, without a doubt. All is not rosy. All is not rosy. But ends up with all governmental funds, compared to other states, with a $4 billion fund balance. Not what it should be, not what it needs to be. But it's not what's being characterized. Our real disagreement is on the first item, because that simply is not economic reality. It doesn't, in fact, reflect what's already occurred, and it is not the way that all the people I mentioned look at it. The bottom half of that is just more the way Illinois has done historically, but rating agencies professionals know that and adjust accordingly. So is Illinois in rosy shape? No, it is not. Does Illinois have much to improve, particularly in pensions, other areas? Absolutely it does. Have we made considerable progress? I believe we have. Have we made more progress than prior governors? I think in many cases we have, but we have a long way to go. But I would never say Illinois' situation is rosy. We have a lot of work to do, but I think progress has been made.
Good answer. Not that I would tell the big shot in Illinois, but that last part of the speech was damn good. I mean, the other part we could have skimmed a little bit. John, a 1-year membership in the City Club at no cost. A mug, just in case you got to go on the street to raise some money. The history of the City Club. You can read the life of Tom Roser. And last but not least, all this good news, could you hold off telling the governor? We're adjourned.